A return to the past for the Philippines. Ferdinand Marcos Junior is set to become president, but could his rule resemble the brutality of his father's? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is the Philippines presidential election. Well, he shares the same name as his father, but will Ferdinand Marcos Jr. share his style of leadership as well? The 64-year-old, better known as Bong Bong, hails from one of the Philippines' most notorious political families. Many considered his dad a dictator who ruled for decades with an iron fist. But in 1986, more than 1 million brave Filipinos marched through Manila to topple his regime. Now, 36 years later, his son is set to take the reins of power.
I extend my thanks to everyone, to all who helped out, to all who joined our cause, to your sacrifices, to your hard work, to your time, your abilities, your eagerness. These types of work, any endeavors as large as this, does not involve one person. It involves very, very many people, working in many very, very different ways. And to all of them, I thank you.
Bong Bong's father became president in 1965. By 1972, he'd imposed martial law, and for decades he ruled with brutality. Thousands who opposed him were either killed or jailed, and about $10 billion went missing from public coffers. It was a horrific time for many Filipinos, but since launching his own bid for president, Bong Bong Marcos has run a targeted social media campaign to rebrand that time in history, not as one of abuse and corruption, but rather a golden era for the Philippines.
My father is the statesman. He's the political genius. He's all that.
Well, critics have accused Marcos Jr. of rewriting history, but the messaging has seemed to work. On Monday, millions came out to vote for him, helping him easily defeat his bitter rival, Leni Robredo. The current vice president, leader of the opposition, and only woman running for the top job, rallied some support from the country's young voters, but it wasn't enough.
Bangaman may hindi pa nabibilang.
Although there are still votes to be counted, although there are still questions about this election that needs to be addressed, the voice of the people is getting clearer. On behalf of the Philippines, which I know you really love, we need to listen to this, because in the end, we only share one country.
And it's not just the presidency where the Philippines is seeing the return of a familiar name. Marcos Jr.'s running mate is none other than Sara Duterte. Her father, Rodrigo's rule has been controversial, to say the least, from vulgar remarks, allegations of sexual abuse, to a violent war on drugs that's left thousands of Filipinos dead. Duterte has always maintained his crackdown was necessary, and earlier this year, he said he would never apologize for the deaths that it caused. So the son of a dictator and the daughter of a strongman look set to rule the Philippines together. And the task ahead will be tough. Millions are unemployed, the economy is struggling, and the nation is more divided than it's been in decades. Soon after it emerged, Marcos Jr. was on the cusp of victory. Protests broke out in the capital.
The electoral fight was already dirty with historical revisionism and blatant lies put forward to the people. So we are here to protest and call on the Elections Commission to answer the blatant lies, blatant violation to the election that are happening across the country.
So let's discuss the future of the Philippines with 6 years ahead under this new regime. Joining me now from Manila is Jose Custodio. He was a consultant to former President Benigno Aquino, the third who was in power between 2010 and 2016. Aries Arugay is a professor of political science at the University of the Philippines in Diliman. And Danilo Arao is the convener of Kontra, Daya, a non-government organization that advocates clean and honest elections in the Philippines. Thanks so much for being with us. Danilo, let me start with you to get this established. I mean, in spite of many claims of irregularities, will Marcos's win ultimately have to be accepted as a legitimate result?
The legitimacy hinges on the credibility of the elections. And based on the documentation of Contra Daya. We've gathered more than 3,000 incident reports during the May 9 national elections. There are doubts with regard not just to the count of the elections, but also the legitimacy of the election system. While there's no mistake that Marcos has been the survey frontrunner in many of the major survey projects conducted by various firms, it cannot be denied that there are certain doubts on the conduct of the election, whether or not it would mean a failure of elections would still be decided later on.
Okay.
But right now, okay, go ahead.
No, I'm just, but it's unlikely that those doubts could somehow, or any irregularities at this point, could really overrule this kind of landslide victory.
Yes, that's correct. But we have to qualify here that when we talk about fraud, it's not just simply cheating in the election, it's also disinformation that has become the major narrative and strategy of the Marcos camp. So that's why this is a very, very interesting case and very, very controversial to say the least. And there are large segments of the population that really cannot accept that particular tragedy that is the May 9 elections.
Right, but let me turn to Aries about that, because with this result, can it be said, that millions of Filipinos simply prefer a strong man over traditional politicians? Or have they been duped by crafty social media campaigns and that disinformation?
I think Marcos Jr. represents both the appeal of strong man rule as well as possible populist authoritarian rule. So in a way, his campaign is an exemplification of traditional politics. You can see from the choice of the allies, from the strategies in the campaign, the Marcos machine was well oiled. It's heavily resourced, and I think as well as very crafty. His non-appearance in debates is a deliberate strategy in order to protect the lead from the surveys and to somehow condition the minds that these surveys are already the likely results of the elections. And because of this, I think the disinformation infrastructure that his camp has built into as early as 2016 when he ran for vice president. By 2022, it was merely harvesting it. So I think this interaction of these two variables, the appeal to strongman rule, because at the end he's really the namesake of his father, and he did not really distance himself throughout the campaign from the shadow of Ferdinand Marcos Jr., our late dictator. But I do think in the end, we must remember the counterfactual that if Sara Duterte also ran for the presidency, that we might have a different picture.
How so? You think she could have won the actual presidency?
If we rely the pre-election surveys wherein Sara Duterte was still in the running, Sara actually was way ahead by almost 10 points against Marcos.
But it's interesting now they've politically decided, it was more strategic to become this kind of power couple holding both of the top offices. Really remarkable. It's interesting because upon winning, Marcos Jr. just said today, quote, "Judge me not by my ancestors, but by my actions." It's kind of ironic given what you just said that, he's made his ancestors so much part of his appeal and his campaigning by bragging about what he says are their accomplishments. How much do you think, though, actually, let me turn to Jose for this. How much do you think he actually does admire how his father ruled the country?
Well, the thing with the entire Marcos campaign is that it practically distorted what his father's record was and presented it as in a positive light. Okay, continuing from what the other guests were talking about, which is the distortion that happened. And me personally, as a historian, we felt the brunt of that. Because it was already he was driven out. The father was driven out in an uprising. Okay, in 1986, there was massive corruption. There was misrule, and all of that was just swept was how do I say this, swept under the rug. No, it's not. It was swept under the rug. It's more on um, it was attacked. That narrative was attacked, and instead. There was this very sanitized view of Marcos as the father as being a president who led the country during a so-called golden era, which was basically not true. And that was
Right.
the narrative that they were pushing, and that is what fueled this election. That's why people, when you talk about them, they would hark back to the father's past, not knowing that the narrative that was given to them was a distorted narrative.
It's
That
amazing
was
that
not
he was
true.
able to turn what most would have interpreted as such a liability into an asset somehow. It was only, what, in 2018 when Imelda Marcos was actually sentenced and, I mean, convicted
Mm,
and sentenced after funneling some $200
Mm.
million to
exactly.
Yeah. It hasn't seemed to matter. And some are saying, let me come back to Danilo about this. Some are saying it really is the effect of mastering these social media campaigns. And Aries was saying, you call this now disinformation infrastructure. So, I mean, Danilo, how has social media actually changed Filipino politics and its democracy?
10 years ago, I would tell you that social media would have a marginal effect in terms of winning or, placing well in any campaign. But right now, as you correctly noted, fake news has become an industry. People earn from fake news, and if you pour a lot of money on trolls and other influencers, people would be able to come up with a good packaging of you. So the Marcos image has been rebranded not just with the advent of social media, but even dating back to 1989. Why is 1989 very important? Because this was the time that the Marcoses returned to the country and they slowly inched their way into the political scene by first winning the local elections, and then later on, Jaime Marcos and Bong Bong Marcos would become senators. So social media, and particularly the disinformation fake news network, worked well to their advantage. And that's why, with the ill gotten wealth that they have, which is, by the way, a historical fact, they're able to use such wealth, such immeasurable wealth, to finance this particular campaign. So their preparations as early as 1989 have worked well for them, and they are now reaping the fruits of their quote unquote hard work uh, as a
Right.
result of such disinformation.
It's amazing because, I mean, Aries, being a relatively young voter, if I can say that, they can craft these campaigns, but don't voters remember martial law? I mean, don't they remember any of the atrocities, or are they willing to, especially the younger generation, willing to kind of negate whatever the history book says? And if someone's willing to rewrite it in a way that's easily sold to them, they're happy to accept that?
Well, historians like Jose can talk more about this, but we're really finding out that our history books are really problematic in having a fair and very comprehensive treatment of martial law. And certain change in educational policies a few years back also made it possible for someone who is not even required to take a Philippine history class before entering university. So this means you have a lot of young Filipinos, which forms, I think, a third of the electorate, who might not even have a decent exposure to what really happened in martial law. This lack of treatment in education is also complemented by other social institutions that have not really paid a lot of attention on the atrocities of martial law. Relatively speaking, we're really far behind this if you compare with other countries in Latin America or even, for example, in South Korea that really made sure that social institutions and education formed this uh, impenetrable collective memory about the dark years of the dictatorship.
Jose, let me ask you then. I mean, they may not remember necessarily, but their
Mhm.
parents and their elders do. Is that kind of oral tradition not at all in effect in the Philippines? Or, I don't know, has it been forgotten and diminished?
Well, the thing with my country actually is that there's a very notorious aspect of it is that we don't really seem to have a historical consciousness, that's deep rooted. There's a tendency to be very forgetful, and it's I don't know if it's a character, it's a cultural trait here, but there's not much focus on that. And then you add that problem in historical consciousness and appreciation. You add to that the political patronage system, or the feudal type of political system that we have in this country, which tends to have horse trading, accommodation. That then you can understand how the Marcoses can first enter into local politics, and then because when they did that, there was no such thing as social media. They were able to come in because of all of the political horse trading that was going on, all the accommodations. And then when social media came in, they banked on that. So social media would happen by the previous decade. I mean, sorry, on the first decade of the 21st century. But prior to that, they were already using emails, okay, the email forwards, where they were spreading their fake historical narrative, or their fake narrative of history. And then uh, the decisive thing for me is that when Duterte sat in office, is that he then provided the Marcoses a government apparatus now to reinforce that narrative and demonize anybody and everybody who would be opposed to Duterte, and therefore making also Bong Bong Marcos a beneficiary of that. And that was none other than Leni Robredo, who was demonized from day one by a very vicious government propaganda machine. So Bong Bong Marcos, who eventually ran for president, would benefit from that, from that advantage given to him.
Okay, so, I mean, the election is basically finalized. You now have Marcos and Duterte family dynasties taking power. Can it work? I mean, can they actually work together and continue to get along for the next 6 years? Danilo, go ahead.
Yeah, it will be very, very interesting. If you know House of Cards, it would be more dramatic than that particular TV series, I would guess. Because we have to remember there are pending disqualification cases against Marcos. The Commission on Elections have apparently decided on them, but we expect these cases to be elevated to the Supreme Court. It will take some time before the Supreme Court will make a final and executory decision on such cases. And in the meantime, those particular disqualification cases would hang on the head, like a sword of Damocles on Marcos. So that kind of a scenario would more likely result in, for example, Sara Duterte becoming president. That scenario is real. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but it's always there. So whether or not they'll get along would be something that remains to be seen given that particular context. But what cannot be denied here is that Sara Duterte is worth watching because even granting for the sake of argument that Bongbong Marcos would last for 6 years, we more or less have an idea of who will be running for president. Because by tradition here in the Philippines, as well as in other countries, the vice president usually becomes a strong presidential contender.
Okay, so you believe it remains to be seen how they will get along. I mean, Aries, do you have any other opinion on that? Because I've heard some say that the Philippines is in for a rough 6 years, in large part because they're not going to work well together. Especially, someone even mentioned with Rodrigo Duterte still there behind the scenes, pulling the strings and more wanting the upper hand than we might realize. I mean, what is your take on all of that?
Right. Yeah, I approach this more as a political scientist who have studied other democracies wherein some form of promiscuous power sharing agreements have been made by parties or by political factions. And the key thing here is how this power sharing agreement will really unfold. How much power will Marcos give Sara Duterte? Sara Duterte has alluded to the desire to become the first well, not really the first, but because Gloria Arroyo served as Secretary of National Defense at some point, but to be a female Secretary of Defense, which is a pretty powerful cabinet portfolio. If this is so, then it means that there is serious division of labor and division of power. And this, unfortunately, for many in the opposition, would mean that these two dynasties are not just really working to get power, but really to share power in the long term, to a point wherein I think we're going to see really a dynasty cartel at work. So it might be a quid pro quo. A Duterte will run in 2028, a Marcos will run in 2034, a Duterte will again run in 2040. So this back and forth between this cartel, we've seen that in other countries, in fact.
Wow, that is a long-term outlook there. Let me ask Jose if you also envision this sort of kind of dynasty cartel going forward. And in the short term, actually, I mean, do you think Marcos is going to be able to keep the promises he's made enough to maintain this popular support?
Well, first, the cartel that was been mentioned. Yes, I do agree with that. If Marcos is able to play his cards right, then he will finish, and then perhaps most likely Sara Duterte will replace him, and just as Aries and Danilo were talking about. Now, the day to day would, however, be different. Okay, because historically in the Philippines, even allies tend to have a fallout. Falling out with each other. Like, for example, during the 1986, following the 1986 revolution uprising that ousted Marcos, you had Cory Aquino and who was the president, and Salvador Laurel, who her vice president, and they were in the same party, and then they had a falling out, despite a so-called um, political arrangement between them. Same thing also you'd have something similar happening in the case of GMA, of Gloria herself, wherein key people who backed her up initially, like, for example, the former president Fidel Ramos, and then I think the Speaker of the House then was Jose de Venecia, who were usually one of her strong supporters. Next thing you know, she had marginalized them. A peculiar aspect of our presidential administrations is the creation of cordon sanitaires, and a creation of a cordon sanitaire of people who are either opportunistic, who want to protect their interests, is usually the cause of friction between two sides in one administration, and can create bad blood and there.
Okay. I'll tell you what, we're down to our last few minutes. I need to get to this question because we are, of course, an international channel here. And there is the question about what this power duo will do with their international relations. Are they looking to reset some of their international relations, particularly with the most powerful at play here, the United States, China, even Russia? Let me ask Aries what you make of it.
Right. Every new Philippine president, so I'm just talking about Marcos Jr. here, often is accorded the informal role of being the architect of the country's foreign policy for the next 6 years. And this gives a lot of room for the president to somehow, particularly Marcos Jr., to somehow reboot some of the relations that President Duterte has quite steered over the past few years, particularly with the United States. So Marcos Jr., I think, just like any other incoming president in the past, will try to somehow balance the relationship between the two. Even academics or analysts in the U.S., in Washington, have said that the U.S.-Philippine alliance, the oldest alliance of the United States in Asia, will likely be revisited, even if it's under a Marcos presidency. In terms of relations with China, Marcos has been a bit more explicit here, saying that he will retain Duterte's more accommodationist and to some more and therefore more defeatist approach with bilateral negotiations with China, therefore putting the Philippines in a position of weakness rather than using some of the leverage that we have, like the arbitral ruling. But I think before Marcos becomes a bit more pro-China, he will try to see whether he can get concessions with the United States. We know that he has an existing contempt of court conviction in a U.S. court. That needs to be settled first before I think he can make advances with the United States in trying to be a better version of Philippine foreign policy against his predecessor.
But in spite of having the vice president he has, you don't expect him to be as confrontational as Duterte, correct?
Yes, because there's really no personal baggage, unlike President Duterte. The baggage is, and in fact, during the martial law years, the Philippines has been the darling of the United States. It's been one of those countries wherein a right-wing dictatorship has been supported by the U.S. in order for the Philippines not to fall into communist rule. And given that we have the largest bases outside of U.S. territory, the Philippines was a key strategic interest during the Cold War, and the Marcoses have basically promised and made and became credible brokers of stability in the Philippines, and that's why they got a lot of support.
Certainly a lot of history there. We could talk about that for another half hour, but unfortunately we're completely out of time for this edition of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists really so much for being with us. Fascinating discussion, and our viewers, of course, as well. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey, and we'll see you next time.